Welcome back, everybody, to Let's Talk About Sleep. Here's the book, Let's Talk About Sleep. The premier way to read about sleep disorders. I'm kind of half kidding, but check it out if you want. It's on Amazon. The link is in the description box down below. As I always say, these videos are for education only. But if you have a question or a comment, leave it in the comment section down below. Once a month, I answer any and all comments and questions. And without much further ado, let's get into today's topic, which is delayed sleep phase syndrome. Okay. So I always talk on this channel about getting appropriate sleep quantity and quality, right? So the average person needs between 7 to 9 hours of sleep, and if there's something like sleep apnea present, we want to take care of it. But also, the third component of sleep is timing. And what I mean by that is, most people, the sun goes down, they start to get tired, they go to bed when it's dark, and they wake up when the sunlight happens, when sunlight comes on. That's kind of the standard thing, right? Which makes sense. When the sunlight starts going down, melatonin gets produced in our brain or gets released in our brain, and the cascade of wanting to go to sleep begins. There are some people, though, where they have circadian misalignment. So our circadian rhythm basically tells us just what I said. Okay, the darkness sets in, melatonin gets released, we should be asleep, sunlight comes up, melatonin stops getting produced, we wake up. Okay, and that's how our circadian, which basically means 24 hours, rhythm goes. But there are some people where their internal clock is set too late or too early. So if the clock is set too late, that's delayed sleep phase syndrome, which is what we're going to talk about today. If it's set too early, that's advanced sleep phase syndrome, which will be the next video. So, and I've done videos on circadian rhythm if you're interested in learning more about it, but today we're just going to focus on delayed sleep phase. So in the case of delayed sleep phase, the person's clock is telling them, I should not go to bed at 11 and wake up at 7, like it would be in the average situation. It's more so like, I cannot fall asleep until 4 a.m. and if I get in my 7 or 8 hours, I'm waking up at 11 or 12. Now, of course, if you work a job or 9-to-5 job, or if you're in school or whatever, that's very difficult to have that kind of bed and wake time and be able to, survive, right? There are jobs, though, where this kind of situation can be allowed for. If somebody has a flexible schedule, the start and wake times can be varied. A person may do fine with this, but in most cases, they're going to have this syndrome, this delayed sleep phase syndrome, where they're having next day problems, okay, because they cannot fall asleep too early in their, to their window of time. And as a result of that, they're constantly behind the 8 ball, right? So, for example, let's say somebody has delayed sleep phase syndrome and their brain is telling them you cannot fall asleep till 4 a.m., but they have a 9-to-5 job. So they have to get to bed or try to get to bed by 11 or 12, and that never works out. So they end up popping medication, they end up popping pills, drinking sometimes, right? And they do this stuff to try to force themselves to go to sleep earlier, and as a result of that, it doesn't work. They end up relying on medications, they get diagnosis insomnia, and just more and more medications get thrown at them, and they never really solve the problem. Okay, and then on top of that, they wake up at 7 a.m. when their brain is still telling them they should still be asleep, and they're not at their best. Okay, so a delayed sleep phase person will tell you differently than somebody who has insomnia. A delayed sleep phase person will tell you, look, if I can get my schedule 4 a.m. to 11 a.m. or 3 a.m. to 12 or 11 in the next morning, that morning I should say, they fine. They do great. They have no problems at all. They get their 7-8 hours. They feel fine. They are no problems. Unfortunately, though, society does not allow for that. So what do we do? What do we do for these people, right? Well, it sounds like a kind of a joke thing, but, one thing we may suggest, especially if it's very, very difficult to treat, well, then maybe you want a job where you can go in later, wake up later, and that way, you're okay. But in those cases where somebody has a locked in schedule and they can't afford to do that, what we usually do is a combination of things. So one is melatonin, right? So we take melatonin in a pill. From this channel, I like melatonin. I use it a lot in my patients. It's gotten some bad press recently, but it's a lot of sensationalism. Melatonin, the dosing for this, in this kind of situation, is not very, it's not hammered out. So what I usually tell patients is let's start with like 1, 2, or 3 milligrams, and you take it about an hour and a half to 2 hours before you plan to go to bed. So when somebody who has delayed sleep phase, right, let's say that they're, like I said, they're going to bed, falling asleep at 4 a.m., we need them to do, closer to what society wants, which would be like 12, let's say, right? So what I would do is maybe I would not start right off the bat trying to get them to bed at 12, but I would try to push it back a little bit at a time. Let's say I would I would tell them, all right, look, let's try having you take the melatonin at midnight, right? So 4 hours before they normally would fall asleep, with the idea that, okay, they'll take the melatonin at 12, maybe by 2 they'll start to get a little bit drowsy and be ready for bed, okay? The next part is probably even more important than though, is having them wake up at the same time every day and get sunlight. Okay, so sunlight is the strongest Zeitgeber we have, which it means time giver in German. Okay, so if they wake up at, let's say, for this example, 9 a.m., right? We get up at 9 a.m. every day, have them get 20 minutes of sunlight, not staring at the sun, but just being out in the sun or having the sun on their face. Some people use bright lights as well for that reason. You have to use at least 20,000 lux. And the idea is when you have them wake up in the morning and get sunlight, it shuts off melatonin. So what you're doing is you're starting to entrain the brain that my sleep time and wake time is within this range of this window of time. Now, it takes time for this to work. It may be very, very difficult, but the key thing, though, is, one, good sleep habits, right? So what I mean by that is not watching TV right up until bedtime, because that, as we know, shuts off melatonin, can make this whole process much more difficult. And consistency. Consistency is so important when it comes to delayed sleep phase. So somebody who doesn't have this problem, a quote normal person, right? They may do the 11 to 7, like that allows for them to do a 9 to 5 job on the weekdays, and the weekends they sleep in till 8, 9, 10 o'clock, whatever. In many cases, they go right back to their schedule on Sunday night, and it's no problem. I don't recommend that, but people can do it. Delayed sleep phase, you can't do that. You got to keep this schedule as consistent as possible. So that's kind of the standard approach. What we do in some other cases, which is a little bit more rare and it's not as widely recommended, is what's called chronotherapy. So what that is, the notion of falling asleep earlier is much more difficult than falling asleep later, which is why eastward travel tends to be more problematic than westward travel, because you're staying up later. Because going east, you have to go to bed earlier, which is harder to do than staying up later. So what chronotherapy is you're basically going to bed a little bit later, like an hour or so later, each night, right? So let's say instead of going to bed at 4 a.m., you go to bed at 5 a.m., then 6 a.m., then 7 a.m., then all the way around until you come back around till 11 p.m., all right? So if that takes, 2 weeks or whatever, 2 or 3 weeks, and then once you're there, boom, you stay there. Okay, and you stay there with melatonin and bright light, like we talked about. Okay, it's a little bit more extreme, but that does work in very, very severe cases. So that's the late sleep phase. Very, very difficult to treat. Very difficult on patients. Very difficult, with family members and such. But there's a genetic component to this. So usually, what happens is patients will tell me, "Oh yeah, my mom or my dad had something very similar to this." So it is out there, be aware of it, and a lot of times it gets misdiagnosed as insomnia. So just be aware of those two things especially. All right, but it is treatable. So that's the video for today. If there's any questions or comments on this, reach out below. And until next time, sleep well.